I want to actually spend our time thinking about what we might call interpersonal enemies, and then invite all of you, all of us, to think about just whether and how what we learn about interpersonal enemies might be transferred into larger questions about, the Jewish people and its enemies. Meaning, I am not going to offer a class in military ethics. I kind of feel like, first of all, it's not an area that I feel tremendous amount of expertise in, and there's a lot to read about that. I actually wanted to see if we could find our way in a different angle. And I hope that'll work and be enlightening and challenging. And if it doesn't, maybe we'll learn something from the ways that it doesn't work, which is also useful. So, without further ado, um, one of the things that I have been involved in my own work for a very long time, it's one of the ways I might describe sort of like my own work in the world for whatever it's worth, is that I'm trying to kind of call into question many of the so-called truisms that seem to sort of dominate public perception of Judaism. The most kind of prominent truism that I've tried to dismantle in my teaching and writing is the idea that, whereas Christianity is about love, Judaism is about something else, fill in the blank, justice, law, fidelity, practice, whatever it is. And, the whole body of stuff that I've written is really kind of about that, about how distorting of Judaism that really is, and how impoverished we become as a result of internalizing that idea, which is essentially anti-Judaism. Another truism that I think is quite pervasive, may even be more pervasive, and that has some truth to it, unlike the other one, but nowhere near as much truth as people assume, is the idea that whereas Christianity teaches us to love our enemies, Judaism teaches us, and here again, something else. You can fill in the blank. Don't be naive. Protect yourself. Whatever the alternative you want to articulate is, the assumption is, anytime I hear a discussion about loving enemies in a Jewish context, inevitably someone will raise their hand and say, well, that's Christianity and not Judaism. And one of the things that happened to me as I was researching my book about love is I came to realize that is, you can choose, after I kind of give you an example of what I mean, either not true or much less true than people tend to think. So here's what happened, and I'm forgive me, I hope, for kind of talking about this in an autobiographical way, but I think it's actually helpful. I hope. Um, when I was writing the chapter in my book about is there a mitzvah to love our enemies, I noticed something really interesting in reading New Testament scholars and Christian philosophers. And that is that they all basically agreed that loving our enemies is at the very heart of what Jesus taught. And when it came to the next discussion, what does loving our enemies consist of? They could not agree at all. Right? So everyone agrees loving your enemies is essential among Christians, but the battles over what it requires, necessitates, demands of us are constant. Here, by the way, is one example in international relations. Tremendous debates in Christianity about what do we do about military enemies, right? Is war ever permissible, right? So some people have a tradition of just war. You have to love our enemies, but you also have to, and then fill in your ellipsis there, combat evil when you see it. And other people say, no, to be a Christian is to be a pacifist. There are endless numbers of examples of this, debates over what loving your enemies is. I'm telling you this because something really interesting happened to me in researching this chapter. I literally had a notepad open and I was jotting down a list of all of the different things that Christian scholars were saying Jesus might have meant by saying, love your enemies. And I got to a list of about 17 items. And I looked at the list. I thought it was so interesting. They can't agree about anything. They're like Jews, right? They argue about everything, right? But then it dawned on me something that like took my breath away. I thought, you know, every one of the items on this list is also attested either in the Bible or in the Talmud or both. All of the things that Christians are saying it means to love your enemies are also Jewish ideals. Very rarely, if ever, put under a heading called love your enemies. but the content was actually very familiar to me. And I wanted to start by showing you some examples of this that might help just kind of ease us into this discussion. And Amy, when you're ready, you can share.
Right.
It's just like this is just I think it's quite like it's almost disorienting to see this. So, for example, very common idea in Christian scholarship that loving your enemies means not retaliating when people hurt you. I've heard many Jews say, well, we don't turn the other cheek, right? When someone hits me, I hit them back harder. And yet, in the daily prayer, 3 times a day in traditional Jewish liturgy, in the Amida, we conclude by saying, V'lemakalilai nafshi tidom, and to those who curse me, may my soul remain silent. A kind of prayer for the ability to be hurt without retaliating. Scroll down if you could, Amy, just a bit. I assume that's, yeah, okay, great. And then a well-known passage in the Babylonian Talmud. I'll just read it in English in the interest of time. The sages taught about those who are insulted and do not insult and return, who hear their shame and do not respond, who act out of love and are joyful in suffering. That's secondary to the point I want to make. The verse says, and they that love God are as the sun going forth in its might. This is a celebration, a valorization of the willingness not to respond. On this, by the way, Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, first chief rabbi of Palestine, makes a kind of magnificent comment. He says, please notice what the Talmud doesn't say. It doesn't mean those who are insulted but don't feel anything. It says those who are insulted and yet manage not to return fire. Those who have the self-control not to be impacted upon in this way, that they react rather than respond. Now, I'll tell you something interesting about how deep this truism has been internalized by Jews. I, in a totally different context, months ago, posted this passage on my Facebook page, and a very prominent conservative rabbi, a very thoughtful person, responded by saying the following. I thought this was incredible and made the point I was making in my book. He responded by saying, I don't like this passage in the Gemara. It's too Jesus-y for me. And I sort of said to him, I was like, too Jesus-y for you? What? I mean, this is called the Babylonian Talmud. Why are you not able to hear what a Jewish source says? Because you've internalized what Christians have told you is Judaism and not Judaism. But this is a great example, not retaliating. Let's keep scrolling. Amy, number 2, diffusing hate. Okay? When someone hates you, what do? Do you combat them, or do you work on sort of creating peace? So the Bible tells this kind of famous law: when you encounter your enemy's ox or donkey wandering, you must take it back to them. When you see the donkey of your enemy lying under its burden and your temptation is to refrain from helping, you must nevertheless raise it with him. Now, there are all kinds of ways to understand this law, the enemy donkey law. One of them is just that there's some minimum standards of decency that you have to abide by. But actually, the history of Jewish interpretation very commonly understands this to be, no, wait a minute. Not only could the law help you not act out on your worst feelings or impulses, acting on an impulse to kindness, even towards your enemies, is what actually can turn an enemy into a friend. So let's scroll down for a moment. Okay, so actually, let's scroll to 5. I'm going to, in the interest of time, I realize we should probably skip this. Okay, great. The Targum, the first translation commentary, kind of integration of translation and commentary into Aramaic. When you see your enemy's donkey fallen beneath its load and would withhold from taking it, here's what Onkelos, this commentator, adds: you should let go of what is in your heart about him and unload with him. Right? The text didn't say that. The text just told you what to do. Commentary says, no, the doing of this thing has the capacity to purge your own heart of the hate that is in it. And then another Targum commentary to this says, if you see, this is Targum Pseudo Jonathan, makes me feel very smart to say that, Targum Yonatan, if you see the donkey of your enemy, whom you hate for a sin that you alone know about, we'll leave that, what that means for another day, and would forego getting close to it, at that moment, you surely must let go of the hatred in your heart. Now, I know this is not a close analytical text class, but I just want to observe, I don't know whether this was on purpose, but this Targum uses the phrase in Aramaic, behahi sha'ata, which could be translated in two ways. At that moment, you must surely let go of the hatred, or for that moment, you must let go of the hatred. Those are very different, and that distinction is very interesting. Does it mean get over your hatred long enough to do what is required of you, or does it mean use this opportunity to heal a breach, right? In other words, the goal is to use classical Jewish language to turn an oyev, an enemy, into an ohev, a lover. That's a kind of that's the project here. Let's keep going. Scroll down, please, Amy. Sorry to put you to work here. Nechama Leibowitz, kind of great 20th century Bible teacher, just wanted to note this. The Targums expanded the spirit of the text, even if they did not reflect its surface reading, meaning she's saying they added this notion that there's something internal that ought to happen here, the clearing, the purifying, the catharsising, I don't know what the verb of that would be, of my heart. It's not just an action, it's letting go of a grudge. Now, source 8 says something that I think is really beautiful, and I want to invite us to sort of just see this for a minute. I'm going to go through several of these and then stop, take questions and reflections, and then we're going to dive into the question of feeding enemies in particular. The Midrash actually imagines that this is the glory of the law, that what appears to be just a law about doing the right thing, in fact, is a vehicle for the healing of broken relationships. What looks like it's just you should do the minimum of what's okay, right? No, in fact, something is much deeper. And here's a good example of how the rabbis can sometimes talk like, oh, we're all fourth graders. And actually, you realize that they're actually saying something very profound in very simple language. So listen to this for a minute. You, God, have established uprightness. Rabbi Alexandroni stated, 2 donkey drivers who hated each other were traveling along the same road. The donkey of one of them fell down. The other saw it, but passed him by. After he had passed him, you can imagine an experience like this. You walk by someone and you think, serves you right. And then you get 10 feet past and you're like, did I really just say that? So after he had passed him, he said, it is written in the Torah, if you see the donkey of him that hate you, you shall surely release it with him. So forthwith, he went back to help him with the load. And then this is where the Talmud, the Midrash, does its thing. The other began to think things over and said, so-and-so is evidently my friend, and I didn't know it. Both went into a roadside inn and had a drink together. What led them to making up? One of them looked into the Torah. That is the meaning of the text. You have established uprightness or righteousness. Again, I just really want to explain that the rabbis are telling us something very profound. You might think biblical law is about establishing minimal good behavior. No, it is about healing and restoring human relatedness. What begins as an act of decency ends as a moment of restoration of relationship. Dramatic case of quote unquote loving your enemies. Again, not under that heading. Let's keep scrolling. We'll skip to Beno Yaakov and go to number 10. Actually, let's go to 11. I just want to make sure there's really enough time for people to get their thoughts in. So here's one more example before we dive into the question of feeding in particular. Schadenfreude, right? The idea of enjoying other people's suffering, right? Famous line from the American writer Gore Vidal, every time a friend of mine succeeds, a little part of me dies inside, right? Horrifying quote, right? Here the book of Proverbs says, right? When your enemy falls, do not rejoice. When he trips, let not your heart exult, lest the Lord see it and be displeased and avert his wrath from him. I won't, in the interest of time, focus on verse 18, but I just want you to see the clear instruction of verse 17. And for just a minute, Amy, I'm realizing as I'm going, I want to do this a little differently. Can you scroll to 13 for a second? Very often, sorry, not 13, all the way down, I apologize, to 17, perfect, thank you. So very often, when I have taught this verse about not exulting in the fall of your enemies, someone with a strong background in Jewish studies will raise their hand and say, wait a minute, you've only quoted one verse. The book of Proverbs also says the opposite. And then they quote this verse from Proverbs 11. When the righteous prosper, the city exults. When the wicked perish, there are shouts of joy. Isn't that saying that there is a place for Schadenfreude, for exulting in the fall of our enemies? To which my response, based on some classical medieval commentaries, is please notice the very striking difference between source 11 and source 17. Source 11 says, it is, if we speak grammar, if you speak the language of grammar, it is in the imperative. It is telling you what to do. When this happens, don't do X. Source 17 is in what's called the indicative. It describes what people do, not what they ought to do, right? The book of Proverbs nowhere says, oh, when the wicked downfall, it's not a verb, but when the wicked fall down, you should exult and delight. It doesn't actually say that. Even if you think that you should, the text does not say that. The text says people do that, but instructs us that we ought not to do that. The most famous example of this, and this is really relevant, I think how it's relevant is worth debating and discussing, but is really relevant to the political sphere because it is not only about my enemy, but it is about the enemies of the Jewish people, is source 12 in the Midrash, says, you find there are 3 instances of joy written regarding Sukkot. You shall rejoice on your festival. It will be for you only joy, and you shall rejoice before the Lord your God 7 days. But regarding Pesach, you do not find that it is written joy even once, right? On Sukkot, we talk about simcha in the Torah over and over again. On Pesach, we don't talk about it at all. Why is that? Says the Midrash. You find that on Pesach, the grain harvest is judged, and no person knows if the scroll, Amy, sorry, no person knows if the year will make grain or will not make it. Another interpretation, because of the death of the Egyptians. And so you find that on all 7 days of Sukkot, we recite Hallel, the Psalms of praise. But on Pesach, we only recite Hallel on the first day and its night. Why? Because in the fall of your enemy, do not rejoice. Right? I mean, this may be familiar to all of you, but if it isn't, it's really worth sitting with for a moment. The reason we do not say Hallel, the full collection of Psalms of praise for most of Passover is because, what do you mean the Egyptians died? And that's a tragedy. Now, the Egyptians were not good guys in the biblical imagination, not even by a long shot. So, okay, what I've just tried to lay out here as a kind of frame for us is it's actually really interesting how the things that Christians very proudly, understandably say, oh, this is the essence, right, are actually for the most part in Judaism too. I'm happy to talk sometime about how I think Judaism does differ when it comes to love of enemies. But I just wanted you to see that a lot of the same ideals are found here too. Let me stop for a minute. And Amy, are there any questions in the chat or comments or thoughts that, if there aren't, we'll keep going. But if there are, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, there's nothing in the chat, but feel free if somebody wants to unmute or raise your hand or stick something in the chat. Now's a great time for questions.
Or tell me, for that matter, if I'm making your head spin. Like, is this surprising? Is it disturbing? Is it, oh, I knew this already? Like, how do you sit with what I've just been laying out? And I could drive you crazy. We could keep going. We could do 17 of these. Amazing. Total silence. Okay. I'm just going to keep talking, and hopefully it's not because I'm killing you, but because you're thinking about it. Uh, okay. So those are kind of the three models that I wanted to give you an example of. And now I think maybe it's time to dive into the really hard one and the most, in some ways, shocking one. So let's go for a minute. As you can tell from the source sheet, I sort of abbreviated as I was going. I thought we would look at more commentaries, but I actually want to make sure there's really time after the hard piece to really talk it out, assuming people want to talk. But if not, I'll go back. Source 18, responding to hatred with kindness. Okay. Um, this is where it gets really difficult. Um, so a famous and controversial um, um, verse in Proverbs says the following thing: Im ra'ev sona'acha ha'achileu lechem. If your enemy is hungry, give him food. Lechem, which means bread, as you know, is a metonym. It's something that stands for, in the Bible, lechem often doesn't mean bread, it means food. Just as simla, a word for shirt, doesn't mean shirt, it means clothing. It's an example that stands for the larger. It's not bread in particular, it's give him food. V'im tzameh, and if he's thirsty, hashkeu mayim, give him water. And then the book of Proverbs says something. This is an interpretive nightmare. Nobody knows what verse 22 is trying to say. And when I say nobody, I mean the history of Jewish commentary, the history of modern academic scholarship. There is some kind of image here that we don't understand, which we will not focus on now. I try to talk about this a little bit in my book. You will be heaping live coals on his head, and the Lord will reward you. If you read that and think, what? You're in very good company. You're in the company of some of the greatest sages in the history of Judaism. Now, the Midrash on Proverbs, excuse me, the Midrash on Proverbs takes this one step further. And I want to be honest and say, just for the interest of like full disclosure, of all of the text I encountered in the 6 years I worked on this book and the 25 years I've been thinking about love as a Jewish idea, this was the single most surprising text I saw. It took my breath away. It made me angry. It made me inspired. It left me confused. Every time I've taught it, I felt butterflies in my stomach because I'm not sure what I think about it. And I have no idea what I want other people to think about it. But I think Torah is there to be wrestled with. And I was excited to share this text with you. So listen to this for a minute. If your enemy is hungry, feed him bread. If he is thirsty, give him water. That's a quote of that verse we just saw. I'll read this in Hebrew and translate, just for those of you who have Hebrew, so you can hear the feel of the rabbinic Hebrew for just a brief moment. Amar Rabbi Chama bar Chanina, Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, Af al pi shehishkim lehorgecha uva ra'ev o tzameh letoch beitcha hachileu v'hashkeu. Rabbi Chama bar Chanina said, even though he arose early with the intention of killing you, but he arrived in your house hungry or thirsty, nevertheless, you should feed him and give him drink. And then comes this wild midrashic interpretation of that verse I said we don't understand. Lama, ki gechalima tachote al rosho, because you are pouring live coals on his head. V'Hashem yishalem lach, and God will reward you. Al tikre yishalem lach. Let's not read it as God will repay you. Ella yashlimenu lach. God will make peace between you and him. Now, just because I am a recovering scholar, I would like to just observe there are many, this text is so difficult and surprising that the various manuscripts all are different on this last word. Yishal menu, Yashli menu. Most scholars agree that this version I gave you is probably the correct version, the quote unquote original. But this is a wild text. Not only is this, oh, I'm walking down the street and I see Jim and Jim hates me and Jim is hungry, so I feed him. No, the Midrash says that's not what Proverbs is talking about. Jim comes to my home with a loaded gun with the intention of killing me and says, Shai, I'm hungry. And I say, would you like a sandwich? I mean, this, by the way, first of all, let's just say this shatters every stereotype we have about Jewish approach to enemies. You might even say it shatters every approach to sanity when it comes to approach to enemies, right? Somebody's hungry and you say, you thirsty? Right? I mean, it's like almost like a Borscht Belt joke, right? Like, it's like you go attack a Jewish grandmother and she gives you a piece of cake. I mean, it's such an interesting notion. And I
Rabbi,
wanted to, sorry?
sorry, Rabbi Held, when you have a chance, there are some things in the chat, and Shoshana has her hand
Yeah,
raised.
let me just say two sentences about this text, and then I want to stop
Great.
and get responses to this. So now I lost what I was about to say. Sorry.
I'm sorry.
Oh no, it's okay. I totally lost it. Oh, I just wanted to share that when I first came across this text, it was a few days before Hadar's annual rabbinic conference. And I was like, I have to teach this text and see what my colleagues all make of this. So I put this text in front of a group of rabbis and I said, so what do you make of this? And it was amazing because several of the people raised their hand and said, oh, you know what this reminds me of? This reminds me of, the cantor in my town invited a neo-Nazi to dinner, and the neo-Nazi eventually became not a neo-Nazi anymore. And then one of my colleagues said, I'm sorry, I have been stalked by white supremacists with guns. I cannot abide a text like this. And she began to sob. And it was amazing. I mean, the conversation was so painful where people were like, is this an ideal or is this crazy talk? Is this important or is this not important? And what I just want to observe about Jewish texts writ large, and then I want to open the floor, is that a midrash can do things, can permit itself to do things that a Jewish legal text will not. This is a midrash. It is not saying the law is that when someone comes to kill you and they're hungry, you must feed them. It is opening a possibility for discussion and consideration. It might be something like, when you think that violence is your only possible resort, are you sure? Ought you take one breath and consider? Now, when you only have 1 second to save your life, maybe that's too much time to be considering. But again, a midrash can just kind of, I like to describe this midrash as a mic drop. It's like, oh, you thought you know what Jewish ethics requires? Try this on for size. I'm leaving. That's literally how this midrash works. Nothing else happens. The next passage is on to the next thing, right? It just drops this and walks out of the room and invites us to wrestle with, what do you do here? How do you think about this? Okay, let's, Amy, love to hear what people have.
Sure. Shoshana, why don't you go ahead? I see your hand raised, and then we can go to the chat, or for those that stuck things in the chat, feel free to jump in.
Okay, Rabbi Shai, when you described this, you said the enemy wakes up in the morning and comes the gun. And when I taught this in Israel and before October 7th, years before October 7th, but still people feel, you know, and the discussion really revolved around is how do firearms change this? Tanhuma didn't have a gun. Someone came to your house to kill you, it was going to be hand in hand. or maybe a dagger. And we did not resolve it. Um, as you
Interesting.
can probably imagine. But there is a place to ask the point at which firearms change how you relate to an enemy who comes to your house, and the amount of time you have, and the level of distraction that's possible.
It's
I don't
interesting,
have any
Shoshana.
answers. I just wanted to make sure that was on the table.
Yeah, I love that. It's a really interesting comment. I really appreciate it. I will say that the couple of times I've taught this text to Israelis, I don't know how many people we have in Israel at the moment on this call, but the couple of times, I should say, the couple of times I've taught this since October 7th, inevitably people start talking about that famous case, which you may realize, you may be thinking of this grandma who chats with a Hamas guy all day, right? As a way of, right? Now, she's not loving him, and she's not making him her friend, but somehow that becomes a survival strategy. It's not quite the same thing as being talked about here, but it's interesting how that is immediately the association that, in my experience, since October 7th, Israelis have. Shoshana, this is a totally irrelevant question, but were you familiar with these midrash before, or did you get it from me?
I got it from you, but long before the book.
Right. No, I just this is it's just a weird thing about this midrash. I'm not trying to take credit for your teaching. Please don't misunderstand.
Well,
I just
you
I
deserve
find
it. What's
I find
what's your
I just
problem?
I find it very, very interesting how under the radar this source is, right? I've taught
Yeah,
this
I mean,
source to like Talmidei Chachamim, to people who really know, and they're all like, that's in Midrash Mishlei? That's the
I
net?
have this
So,
huge yeshiva-ish book on Al Tisnad Chicha B'Levavecha or something. Half of it's written in Rashi script. I can barely read it, but I don't think it's. And
yeah.
if it is,
So,
it's like a footnote.
okay, Amy, what do you got in the chat? Thank you, Shoshana.
Okay, so going back a little bit before we entered into this text,
Okay.
Mariah shared perhaps the difference is in the line drawn on how far one should go, how much self destruction is permissible or desirable. If love of enemy comes at the cost of love of self, would Judaism and Christianity still agree?
Yeah. So, okay, wonderful. So, such a great question. It's a great, actually, many questions rolled into one. So, I think that the impulse behind that question is basically right. That as a rule, sort of writ large, Judaism has a more immediate impulse to self protection. However, I want to, if I could, with all due respect to, in other words, without in any way trying to pick on the question, I just love what the question opens for us. I have, as I have gotten older, I have gotten more and more skeptical about sort of sentences that are like Judaism says X, Christianity says Y. And the reason is that Judaism most often says X and Y, and so does Christianity, because vast traditions contain many voices. I'll give you an example of this that is directly related to our theme that I keep thinking I should write something about, but I can't somehow find the mental space to do it. Okay, here's another truism that quote unquote we all know. Christianity says that you should forgive people who hurt you no matter what unconditionally, whereas Judaism says we only forgive someone after they apologize. Raise your hand if you've heard that, right? The answer is all of you, right? Everyone has heard that, no matter what your background is, from Haredi to Reform to secular, we all quote unquote know this. A couple of years ago, within a span of 3 days, first I read an essay by the Israeli philosopher Dani Statman, who's a professor at the University of Haifa. And Dani Statman argues that's a total misreading of Chazal, of the sages of the Talmud. In fact, Jewish ethics says we have to forgive people unconditionally. Then I was reading an essay by Anthony Bash, who is the most prolific contemporary Christian scholar of forgiveness. And he says, what do you mean forgive people unconditionally? That's unjust. You don't forgive anyone until they apologize. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. I thought Judaism says X and Christianity says Y. But now I'm reading a contemporary Jewish philosopher who's saying Y, and the most famous Christian on this who's saying X. So what do we mean when we say Judaism and right? It totally blows it wide open. So the reason I'm saying this is Moriah or Moria, I'm sorry, I don't know how to say your name. your question, I think it's wonderful, and I think it's right about the larger impulse that we associate with Jewish text. Although even that we should have some questions about. So I think I guess I'm saying this is a very elaborate rabbinic version of yes, but. How's that? That's the best I can do. Yes, but this question is more complicated than we sometimes like to think. Amy, you got more?
Sure. Elisa pointed out that live coals was a way in which some ancient cultures brought heat as a way of healing to a sick individual.
Interesting. Yeah, there's a lot of kind of scholars of the Bible digging around in anthropology, trying to figure out like what is this ritual that we're talking about. Maybe that's right. I really don't know. I actually feel like this is actually a little bit above my pay grade. Um, it's you know we might say there's two questions here. What do we want to figure out this text meant to the author of Mishle, Proverbs? And then what have Jews throughout the centuries thought this meant, right? Two interrelated but not quite overlapping questions. Um, One of the things that some Jewish writers say that I think is sort of interesting, um, although actually we can see this inside in a minute in Gersonides in Ralbag, is that heaping live coals on their head is not, in fact, an allusion to an ancient ritual. I don't know if this is right or it's wrong, but it's actually a metaphor for shaming someone into confronting the horrors of the hate they bear for you. Almost like what practitioners of nonviolence talk about nonviolence being meant to do, right? Some of you, many of you, maybe all of you have seen, some of, essays of the people who influenced Martin Luther King, for example, in the Indian nonviolence movement, that one of the reasons you don't strike back is you are forcing the person attacking you to confront the horror of their own behavior, which some Jewish essayists will say that's lovely, but you might get killed, right? So that it's not an easy position. People know what I'm talking about. Is that familiar? The idea that nonviolence is not just about your refusing violence, but rather that it's the most effective way to force someone who is behaving badly to have a mirror held up to them. Your refusal to go where they're going forces them, at least in theory, to confront the horror of their own behavior. Something like that. Other folks.
So the last one I want to bring your attention to
Oh,
is
great.
is Gina, who said it all makes sense, and I've never bought into the eye for an eye ideology. However, what happens the closer and the more immediate the threat from an enemy? For example, someone is threatening me because I am Jewish.
Right. So, it's interesting to me that this text says nothing. I think that's deliberate about why this person hates you, right? You can imagine someone who hates you because they're racist, anti Semitic, someone who hates you because you've wronged them terribly. You absconded with their money. I don't know what it is. You destroyed their life in some way. You are now married to their ex-spouse. It could be a million things. And interestingly, the Midrash is not interested in that. And what I wonder is whether that itself is meant, that silence is meant to be a provocation. Whether we're supposed to assume that the Midrash, Rabbi Chama, is saying, I don't actually really care in this moment why you hate them. That's not really the point. And that's very threatening. I have to say, I don't know about you, but I experience that as very threatening because there are some hatreds I'm willing to give up. There's some hatreds, not only am I not willing to give up, I believe I'm justified in. Right? So let's just say this very concretely, right? There is a guy who I don't get along with at work. We're rivals. We bicker. I feel like he says not nice things about me because we're competitive, right? And he comes to my house and I'm like, okay, you know what? I can diffuse this. Okay, what about when Yichi Sinwar comes to my house? Right? Like, well, I'm supposed to be like, hi, would you like a bowl of soup? I got to tell you, like, that point, this text makes me cringe, right? And I want to sort of really be honest about that, right? This text, if this text doesn't disturb you, doesn't disturb us, and I'm saying that you, if this text doesn't disturb us, I think we're not sitting with the sheer wildness of what it's proposing, right? I mean, you know, imagine I'm like a black man in 1964 and the head of the KKK comes into my house and says, I'm starving. I'm supposed to be like, well, you're hungry? I mean, isn't that crazy talk? But maybe it's not. Maybe the Midrash wants us, again, the Midrash, not the halacha, right? The Midrash, not Jewish law, wants us to consider, is that crazy? Is that crazy? Now, this text is what I meant when I said, that I wanted to try to kind of get at questions of feeding people at war through the interpersonal. This appears to be a situation, somebody hates me. This is not someone who's at war with the Jewish people or like attacking my country, right? This is like someone who hates me. And I will say, at one point during the worst phase of hunger in Gaza, without trying to make some big statement, I just posted this text and I said, I would be curious to hear from people whether you think this resonates with you at all in this moment. And predictably, some people were like, oh, look at this rabbi deceitfully posting liberal texts about interpersonal relationships, you know, and applying them in a totally inappropriate way to a situation of existential war. You know, and I didn't, in my newfound maturity, which is about a week old, I didn't respond. What I wanted to say was, it's amazing how many words you put into my mouth. I literally just posted a text, actually hoping that we could have the very discussion. You just said something in the most hostile possible way, making assumptions about me. Whereas, in fact, what I actually wanted people to think about, because I find it confusing, not because I wanted to make some big statement, is like, is this meant to guide us even right now?
Right.
Right? That was actually my question. So it's just it's interesting how ferociously, and of course I understand why how ferociously people respond. But I guess I wanna take a risk here and ask, at least for a few minutes, do you think that this text is helpful for thinking about hunger in the kinds of ways that many of you are involved in a situation where there is hunger as part of a larger moment of war? And I want to not litigate here is the Israeli military ethics. I mean, that's obviously relevant, but I want to try to get at something else, which is like, is there something here to learn that ought to be applied or that can be applied or that maybe Dafka specifically can't be applied to situations of group conflict rather than personal conflict? I also, before I open the floor, I want to just add a footnote, which is, does the fact that he arrives hungry play into this at all? Meaning, is he actually vulnerable? And does that change the calculus, right? It doesn't say when someone comes into your house to kill you and is feeling strong and robust, ask if they want to listen to some music with you. It's specifically talking about, maybe, I don't know, I'm asking really. I think I should have said this in my book, and I don't think I did, because it didn't really dawn on me until someone pointed this out to me in a shiur, in a class after it came out. Maybe part of the point here is another way of saying, when your enemy comes to kill you, but arrives in a reduced capacity and is vulnerable, then you have a chance to actually reconcile with them by feeding them. Like, is that the point? Is their hunger more essential to this text than you, Shai, have seen before? And I'm totally open to that. I think that's actually a beautiful reading. Doesn't make it any easier for me, but it's at least worth considering. Okay, thoughts, Scott? You had your hand up, so why don't you go first?
Thanks. So what occurs to me is, if someone comes to attack you and they're willing to make known that they are hungry, maybe they're not completely committed to this agenda of attacking you. And
Oh, so that's
so
another version
maybe
of what
what
I
I'm
just said.
reading
Wonderful.
is,
Great. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry, keep
Maybe
talking.
one reading is that is an opening for an alternative outcome that is the pathway for which is feeding them.
I love that. That's very close, I think, to what I was just proposing. I'm trying to think for a minute about whether it's the same or shaded slightly differently. You added something here that isn't obvious to me from the text, but I think it's really interesting, which is he makes it known that he's hungry. What I was sort of kind of imagining, just kind of based on how I heard the words, I don't think it says this either, is that he arrives in your home and you see, like you can sometimes tell someone is, famished, exhausted, right? It doesn't say, right? Shishkim lo hargecha uva ve'amar lecha siper lecha shehu ra'ev. He told you he was hungry. So I was sort of therefore assuming that you discern that about him. What you're saying is interesting because you're describing, forgive me, I just lost whether you actually use this words. He's making his vulnerability known, which is not something that someone who's about to harm you will frequently do. I love that. I
Right.
think it's very beautiful. I don't know if it's what the words say. I don't know if that matters, but it's a beautiful notion, which is that maybe one of the ways you discern that someone is talkable to, pardon my English, is precisely that they're still being human with you in some way, right? It's very beautiful, hard, but beautiful. Thank you. Other folks want to like share something? Yeah, Kim, please.
Um, so what it's making me think about, I've been reading a little bit about nonviolent communication, where like the idea is anything like what's behind a feeling is a need, and those needs are universal. Rest, hunger, acceptance, appreciation. And so when we think about when a person is hungry, it could be one of these underlying needs. And if there is a pause in somebody coming into your home, they didn't just shoot you, there's a pause, they're probably saying something to you. And so,
Mm,
what is it that you're hearing? I mean, nonviolent communication is really about like hearing what is actually the need behind what is being expressed. And
mhm.
so that's the like invitation. I mean, it's hard to grapple with you having the ability in that moment to be able to do that, but potentially the invitation to understand what that need is and help that person feel seen. Because the whole process of it is to basically name that in a way and help and like take down the temperature in the room.
Yeah, that's lovely. I mean, I feel like both of your comments, they're so rich. Maybe someone here will remember. I have like a total incapacity to remember, like a terrible visual memory. But I saw a documentary years ago made by a young, I think, British Muslim woman who goes to interview a bunch of white supremacists. Anybody remember what I'm talking about? The film is it's a documentary. She reads about white supremacists in the US and she's fascinated by them. And she decides, I'm going to interview a bunch of them. And her friends and her family all say to her, are you insane? You're like a 4'9" Muslim woman. Are you crazy? She's like, I have to. I just have to. I have to understand these people. And like being a filmmaker means taking risks. I'm doing it. And this is what I remember. I hope I'm not embellishing this. I remember that she talks about one of the men she interviewed. She goes to see him and she asks him about himself, and they begin a correspondence. And eventually, I mean, I find this so moving. Eventually, he writes to her and he says, I wanted to thank you for something. You're the first person who's ever asked me about myself. And it's like an astonishing moment. It's astonishing, right? Like you see this and you like want to just start sobbing when you realize like and I don't mean to sound Pollyannish, but where does a lot of hate come from? Right? Like some of these guys are just desperately lonely and broken. And there's an amazing epilogue because he ends up writing to her and he says, which I think many of you will appreciate in a morbid sort of way. He writes to her and he says, I want you to know at a very big moment today, I shook a black man's hand. And it's really amazing. And then he says, P.S. not a Jew yet. I'm not ready for that. It's amazing. It's horrifying. It's funny. It's funny in the worst possible way, right? But it's that moment. You're the first person who ever asked me about myself. It feels to me like, Kim, it's kind of what you're saying, right? And like, I don't know. But like, how do you know? How do you know you're not going to be like, tell me about yourself, and they shoot you in the head, right? You don't know. Which is again, I think, why this can only be a midrash, not a halacha. The halacha is never going to tell you end your own life in a misguided attempt at compassion, right? It's never going to talk like that. I don't know. I love both of your comments, Scott and Kim. They're really rich. They're so hard. Let's see if there's anybody else who wants to get in here before we kind of just try to move on a little bit and move to closing. So let me ask you a funny question then. I mean, I'm putting you in the position of a rabbi or a congregational leader. Someone asks you, I'd like you to get up and speak about feeding Gaza. Would you speak about this text? Just to be clear, and I mean this, please don't mishear, I almost don't care what your answer is. I'm interested in sitting with that precise question, if that is clear. Like, and if you would, how would you? How would you nuance it? How would you say, no, this speaks directly to Gaza? Or how would you say, what are you talking about? This is, totally unrelated. Right? What would you do with that question? Barbara, is that you?
Having never given a talk like that, I don't think that I would use this text because I don't assume that the Gazans are all enemies.
Great. So that's an amazing comment because that disentangles this text from Gaza for the opposite reason that many people would want it. Many people, like the woman on my Facebook page who I didn't know, wanted to disentangle them because they thought it was too, I don't even know what language to use here, too loosey-goosey, lovey-dovey. Not, and you're actually saying, no, not everyone in Gaza is an enemy. Isn't that the whole point? Love that. It's a beautiful, yes. I mean, there's both a very beit midrash comment, like, oh, no, these things that seem analogous are not analogous at all, and a really interesting ethical claim. I love that. Thank you for that. Shoshana, are you raising your hand?
Yeah, then I decided to go look up the text, but I don't think I'd start with this. There's a midrash about Joseph and his brothers when they're coming back um from burying Jacob, and then all of a sudden the brothers get really anxious, and it says that Joseph went off the beaten path and looked into the pit where they'd thrown him. And I think it's Rabbi Norman Lamb of Yeshiva University, who talks about, that's what I was trying to look up, that's when they got frightened. He's going to remember what we did to him way back then, because he went and looked in the pit. And when he comes back, that's when they start saying, our father made us, told us,
right,
and Jacob isn't recorded as having said that, and he says, no, don't worry, I will provide food for you and your children.
Right.
And I've used that in my Israeli congregation again years ago to talk about asylum seekers, which was very controversial. People in the congregation were collecting food for asylum seekers, and not everybody was happy about it. That was actually, the argument went to sleep when a woman who grew up in hiding in Holland stood up and said, just a second, when they took us away to hide from the Nazis and we had to leave our grandparents behind, and I knew I'd never see them again, all we wanted was someone to come to help. And I will never stand aside. So that's where I would start. And yeah, and I mean, I'm here tonight because I want to talk about donating towards food in Gaza and really about who's safe. And yeah, that's
right. Okay,
the whole reason I'm here tonight.
let's take two more, and then I want to sort of try to. I'm not even going to pretend to tie this, but I want to at least bring it to a close. I see Carla, and again, is it Moria or Mariah? I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Yes.
So, Carla, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question. Why, if you want to help, but they don't want your help because you're a Jewish organization?
Who's the they in your question?
Like, can be the Gazans, can
Turkey,
be
but they took our
in
help.
Turkey, in Africa, in anywhere. Like, why, if you want to go and help, but they don't want you to help because you are Jewish?
Right. I mean, anyone have an easy question? So this is really hard. I mean, I think what some of these sources would say is your job is to offer help and be sincerely willing to give it. It's not to control the responses of those to whom you offer it. Right? So it might be awful. I mean, in fact, it is awful, but it's not necessarily your responsibility to coerce or coax people into what they're not willing to take. I mean, for example, although I think we're probably not going to end up reading it inside, I brought a passage from Ralbag, one of the great medieval rabbis, Gersonides, who basically says, the issue is your character. The issue that should concern you, I'm not endorsing this view, but I'm at least kind of playing with it, is like, who are you? Are you willing to offer food to someone who's hungry, regardless of what they think about you? It's not forcing them to accept it. Meaning, when you offer food and someone rejects it because you're a Jew or an Israeli, that makes a statement about them, not about you. Whereas if you withhold it, it also makes a statement about you.
Okay, and I have another question that happened to us before. Why, if you are going to help, but they tell you that you need to cover your, like, for example, our teacher has a Magen David, so you need to cover the Magen David if you want to go and help. Like, it's hard.
It is very, very hard. I mean, if you're asking me, Shai Held, which I don't claim even remotely to have any, expertise here, if we're talking about actually a case of pikuach nefesh where someone is going to die otherwise, and the refusal is coming from authorities rather than starving people, so then I would probably do it. If the refusal is coming from starving people themselves, then I think there's more of a discussion to have. But a government that says, I don't want your help in feeding my starving people, I'm guessing that in most cases, that government has shown indifference to the well-being of their people in the first place. Right? It's like Hamas saying, I don't want Israeli help feeding Gazans. Well, we know that Hamas does not care very much about the well-being of non-Hamas members in Gaza. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not surprising to me. So I think it would matter to me who is saying it. And that's hard. That's hard. I love these questions. I wish I knew the answer. And I'm sort of in awe of, honestly, doing the kind of work where that's the kind of question that you're struggling with. I mean, if only those were the kind of questions that most of us spent our time wrestling with. I'm sorry I don't have a better answer than that, but it's the best I can do, on one foot. Yeah. Moria, I keep doing that to you.
It's Moria.
Moria, perfect. I guessed right. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the answer before. I just wanted to refer to what you asked about if I would use the text. I think it opens a beautiful tension, and it's definitely a discussion point. I think that the question that I would ask, like following that text, is very much like you talked about, the tension between the individual and the collective. And I think maybe that's the way I was also asking the question before, but like, do Christians and Jews agree and disagree? And I think very much of it has to do with the collective and individual lens of like, you can have an ideal as an individual and it can be very high. But if the moment you look at it as a collective, you have to be more cautious because you want to protect your loved ones, and you're not just talking ideals now, you're talking real life.
Right.
And I also, so I would really dig into this, like what are ethical considerations that are valid on the individual level, and what are the considerations? Is the same ethics applicable to both, and why not, or why yes? Like that's a question I struggle with a lot, and I would definitely like ask it right after the text. And then the other thing you were asking, like you were getting in much early on, like nonviolence, and I've really looked into it, and I used to love this approach most of my life. And then I realized that the whole theory is built on the person that hits you has to have a moral conscience that's very deep and built in order for that to work. Because you're appealing to his conscience, and if he doesn't have the same values that you have, then it doesn't bother him that he hits you in the face, then the fact that you're not getting back at him doesn't change his heart. Like that's what reality has painfully taught me. But that's that's all the directions my thoughts are going from your question.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, it's interesting because maybe one of the ways, if I were to take your very raw, honest human formulation and just make it a tiny drop more abstract, is like, what role does dehumanization play in making nonviolence work? And by the way, I think if we're really honest, that works in two directions in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, right? I mean, that is right. What happens when I don't see a human being there anymore, right? It's not what I see. I mean, one of the things I will just say, like, for the whatever, I mean, my politics don't matter. I would say that, like, on these kind of issues, I am like to the left, but not bananas, right? If I can describe a place on the spectrum, I find it. I'm always struck. I'm consistently struck by the role dehumanization plays in discourse, like constantly between Israelis and Palestinians, in ways that are often, I think, actually quite self-defeating. I'll give you an example of this. I actually said this recently at a conference. I was on Zoom, but the conference was in Israel. And I would say half the room applauded and half the room wanted to rip the screen and attack me. I said, what I thought was a very simple comment that I didn't even think was particularly ideological, honestly. I said, the problem of dehumanizing people you're at war with is twofold. One is, once you've dehumanized people, there is nothing that is illegitimate to do to them. And number two, and this is actually like an argument from the right, if you will, if you dehumanize someone and you say they're less than human, you've exonerated them because they've no longer done anything wrong. If it's true, as Israeli news anchors were given to saying, that Hamas are tatei adam, subhuman, then when they attacked on October 7th, they didn't do anything wrong. Nobody attacks a lion for ripping apart a lamb. It's precisely because they're human that what they did is awful. That's the point. So it's the dehumanization is actually, it both brings out the worst in me and actually cuts the legs out from what I'm arguing against and what I'm trying to fight. It's really so incredibly destructive. And yet, right, sometimes people are so consumed with hatred to an almost sociopathic degree that it's hard to appeal to conscience. I think, I mean, at the risk of sounding ridiculous, I want to just express my gratitude for the comments today, because they're really like some really rich, provocative, and for whatever it's worth, I am more bewildered by this text now than I was when we started. So thank you for that. Let me say two quick final things and then close. And Shoshana, I'm sorry, I'm just not going to get there.
Okay.
Two final things. One is, I brought you a kind of epilogue for your own study, if you're so motivated, that I thought would be really interesting for some of you. First, an essay by Rabbi Cheskel Levenstein that at least a couple of you have studied with me before. Cheskel Levenstein was, just for the Israelis, this will immediately mean something. He was the mashgiach ruchani at the Mir Yeshiva, okay? Meaning he was a very prominent Haredi, ultra-Orthodox figure. And he writes, this completely liberal Jews are consistently surprised that this is what an ultra-Orthodox rabbi says, He writes this long essay in which he says, hatred is always forbidden in Judaism. And anytime you see a source that says you're supposed to hate someone, know that it really means you're supposed to hate the things they do, but it is forbidden and is corrupting of your character to ever hate them, period. And he sounds, by the way, like a Reform rabbi. He says, if you see a law that requires you to hate someone, you've misunderstood the law. That is inconceivable. I mean, it's wild, right? I mean, it's wild. And then I brought you a contemporary American philosopher, Jeffrey Murphy, who says, why do you think that? Why do so many people think that hatred is always a vice? He even says, I forget whether it's in the excerpt that I gave you, he says, you know, people say if I hate anyone, it destroys my ability to love. I don't believe that. I can hate someone who villainizes immigrants. That's the example he gives. This is the old essay, who villainizes immigrants and refugees and people who are not of the same skin color. And he's like, I find that it has not affected my ability to love my children. Like, I just don't understand that truism. I mean, and the article is, in a really counterintuitive way, a defense of limited hate. Hate is sometimes okay, he says. I bring this to you without commentary. I just thought some of you, perhaps, late at night on your own or with a chavruta or a study partner, it's really interesting. I mean, these two people have never been paired together, the Rosh Yeshiva or whatever at the Mir and some American philosopher, but they're really, really interesting to think about. I wanted to say one other thing about one way that I think Jewish ethics tends to be different from Christian ethics. And again, I'm saying tends because of what I've said earlier about different voices within different traditions. I say this in my book. I don't think I say this well enough. It is only because my book came out after October 7th and everyone I met wanted to talk about Hamas that it helped me clarify something in my mind that I want to just share with you as a final thought. And it's not a cooked thought, but one of the challenges of talking about what we owe our enemies is that the word enemies in English, maybe in Hebrew too, but certainly in English, we use it for such an incredibly diverse array of people. And it is not obvious that what I owe one of those people, I owe all of those people. So, the examples I always give, Shoshana has heard these 50 billion times, but like an enemy can be someone at work who hates me. An enemy could be my Aunt Zelda, who I used to run a bakery with, and she made off with the money, and I think she's a crook, and we haven't spoken in 25 years. Or my enemy could be Vladimir Putin. Is it so obvious that the halacha in one case, Jewish law, is exactly the same as it is in the other? It's not obvious to me. Not obvious to me. I mean, and interestingly, for Christians as a rule, it is obvious. Meaning, like I was at a conference, I asked a prominent Christian theologian who's a dear friend, I said, Sarah, are you saying unequivocally that according to your understanding of Christian ethics, you are obligated to love Vladimir Putin? And she says, I thought was incredibly candid and honest. This is Sarah Coakley, the philosopher, theologian at Oxford, Cambridge. Sarah, she said, I want to be clear. I don't really have a clue how to do it, but yes. And I sort of said, I think here that the kind of normative thrust of Jewish ethics is much less certain than that. I think if you had asked most rabbis in the Middle Ages, am I obligated to love a genocidal nut, right? I think many of them would have said no, or only in very limited ways. And yet, remember why we don't say Hallel on Pesach. Because of the Egyptians. Now, just to give you a headache, it doesn't say because of Paro. It says because of the Egyptians. And I don't know whether we're supposed to assume that every Egyptian soldier hated the Jews, or whether Egyptian soldiers are doing what soldiers do, right? In other words, who are we talking about? Now, if you have a headache, you're in a good place on this question, I believe. Meaning, I think this is really hard, really, really hard. And I'm sorry for those of you who came hoping that like you would walk out with a yes or no. A, that means you've never met me, and B, I apologize. but I wanted to just sort of try to open this a little bit and to bring us into this question from an unusual angle. Plenty of things are out there to read about military ethics, but this I thought might be a different way to think through some of this question. And really, again, thank you for the comments, which were pretty universally amazing. And thank you, Amy and Diana, for the invitation. And I hope to see many again.
Rabbi Held, I don't know if you have more time. We are scheduled to be on here until 2:30. We were going to go into breakout rooms, but there's so many rich comments in the
oh really
in the
okay
chat.
No, tell me. I'd love to hear. Yeah, I have a few minutes.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So going back, in Carla's first example, would working through a third party or other intermediary be one possibility for mitigating the conundrum of those don't want to receive aid or assistance from you? And then the conversation sort of unfolds from there. The issue, Shoshana said, the issue of a potential recipient not accepting the help is sometimes mentioned as a reason that there is no blessing for giving tzedakah, charity, because the mitzvah might not be completed if the offer is rejected.
Yeah, so, okay, great. So
for the first
one, for the first one, yes, although I think that's kind of coming at Carla's question. It felt to me like from a different angle than what Carla was raising, which sort of like, I thought, Carla can certainly weigh in and tell me I misheard her. I thought the question was sort of, how does it affect the relationship between me and the recipient when they don't want my help? It feels to me like that answer might be a more sort of practical, how do I solve the problem? I sort of heard the question on a different level, but I think that's really interesting. And that's in some ways, I mean, I would be interested in hearing from people who have real experience in the field on that question more than I am from myself. For the recipient not accepting it, yes, this is a famous an influential position among the Rishonim, among medieval sages, that one of the reasons we don't say a blessing before an interpersonal mitzvah is because the reality is that I'm not the only party involved. And someone else might refuse the gift. Now, I'm not sure that this is not an over-interpretation, but the Israeli philosopher Avi Sagi makes this really interesting reading of this idea and says that is halacha's way of saying that a moment of interpersonal giving is fully relational. And I can't make a bracha because that would give the impression that it's entirely about me and my actions, but it's not. The other person might say, I don't want you in my hospital room. You're not really welcome here, either because they don't want you or because they don't want to be seen. In other words, that the way halacha has to acknowledge the irreducible two-ness, if you will, of an interpersonal giving is by saying you can't make a bracha. That makes it all about your agency, your decision. I'm not sure that's what those sources were saying, but I think that's also a beautiful thing to say. And yeah, I mean, it is interesting to think about what happens when hate is so inculcated that someone can be starving and say, I don't want your help. I mean, that in itself just kind of makes me want to cry about like what we've done to ourselves and each other, that might be something someone might say, right? I'd rather my family and I starve than take your food. I mean, that's hard, right? I mean, it's just hard on so many levels to even process that.
I think that leads in nicely to Gina's next comment that said, it's an interesting idea to look at whether the aid from a Jewish person or organization is being refused by a government while their people are starving. And it is not necessarily the starving people themselves who are refusing the help. And maybe then it is worthwhile to hide the Jewishness in order to be able to help.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to the thing I said. I don't know if I remember now if it was in response to Gina, but I think that's exactly, the issue that I'm assuming people involved in development and relief work confront all the time, right? Under many governments, people who are actually suffering don't get any say. I mean, in a funny way, and I'm again here, this is an observation. It's not some grand political statement. what I think a lot of the hostage families in Israel were saying is, look, even in this situation, those who are suffering the most are not being given a say, right? We don't have a place at the table the same way that others do, right? It's the same kind of structure of an argument. I'm not making comparison, let's all try to like have some benefit of the doubt that we're talking in a reasonable way. But I think you hear that kind of thing a lot, which is governments often forget the people who are most directly and horribly affected by policy. We know that, right? Like people talk about issues, they don't talk about families who don't have food stamps, right? They talk about government. But in fact, right? And that's the work of you might say that's one of the jobs that religion ought to play in a society. I remember once I was interviewing for a job, and the person interviewing me was a professor of economics at like a very prestigious university. And he said that he went to a talk, and economists can sometimes talk like this, meaning not that they're like, they don't care, but their discourse can sound very like removed from human experience. And he said, I raised my hand and I said, but what about disabled children under this policy? And he said, well, that is an externality. Externality is, a term in economics for like an unintended. And he said, I started yelling, that's not an externality, damn it, that's my child. Right. And like that's a little bit what we end up talking about. And maybe one of our jobs, from a Jewish perspective, is to remind governments, like, this is not just about what governments feel about each other. This is actually people who don't have lunch.
So there's a beautiful and hard question in the chat that I think maybe we can end on, which is maybe we don't have to love, but we should not hate.
Right. Right. I mean, okay, there's so much to talk about there. I mean, it raises, of course, the question, which those of you who know me know I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out and find language for what I think Jewish ethics actually means by love. It's a great question. I would agree that not hating would be a huge start. It is worth saying that Vayikra, Leviticus, immediately moves from don't hate to love. Lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, you shall not hate your brother in your heart. Ve'avta l'reacha kamocha, but rather you should love them. But it's not inevitable. Maybe you could say some of us would be content to live in between those two halves of the verse. But it's a great point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rabbi Held. Thank you so much. I think we're going to end there. I know my head is swirling. I think that this is an amazing network. We can turn to each other to continue to process and digest. But in the meantime, I just want to give you a heads up that we will be sending out a survey that will take you less than a minute to fill out, and we really appreciate your feedback. And I'm also dropping into the chat a sign up for a webinar that's coming up about what funders really want to hear when you share your story. And I think I said this in the last session that, we do these sessions also that we can speak about our work from a Jewish perspective and Jewish framings. So thank you all for joining us. We'll send a follow-up email with some of these resources and the recordings, the survey, and the sign up for this next webinar as well. So thank you all so much for your time, and have a great afternoon and evening.